And good morning, Third Church family. So happy that you're here with us again as we continue our study on the miracles of the Bible in hopes that we all find ourselves in the miracle zone. To that end, let us begin in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Hear these words. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge two boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. He sat down and he taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water. Let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John and the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus says to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men." So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. May God add a blessing to the hearer, reader, and doer of his holy word. And for our time finding ourselves in the miracle zone today, I want to use for a subject, when Jesus gets into your boat. When Jesus gets into your boat. You know, when Jesus calls us, some would think all he has to do, it says, "Hey, follow me," and it happens automatically. But it doesn't seem to work like that. This boat called our life, we don't like it to be rocked. But if it's not rocked, it just continues on a course for some destructive place, some existence of unfulfillment, disappointment, heartache, and heartbreak. So Jesus decides to get in our boats and rock them. Why? Because he wants a greater commitment from us. He wants to show us how much we are loved. He wants us to taste and see that he is good. His mercy is everlasting and his truth endures through all generations. He wants us to know a full joy from serving God. So Jesus gets into our boats. And until Jesus gets into our boats, our disposition can be the following. Jesus is just Jesus. This guy that was on the cross, that rabbi who prays and teaches and preaches, I heard he was a healer, even came to save the world. I go to church, and that's who we praise, and the preacher talks about this man a lot. So to me, Jesus is a little bit more than a regular person who has some authority, but no real rule over my life. He's a part of my life, but not the head of my life. He may have some good suggestions from now and then, but he does not lead or guide me, and the final decision is ultimately mine. I have Jesus then compartmentalized in my life, but he's not the center of my life. He's not the center of my world. He's not the center of my joy. He's just Jesus. So many, Jesus is just another person in history that has little or no bearing on our lives. And that seems to be how it goes until Jesus steps into our boat. We're going on about daily life, daily duties, and Jesus is looking for a greater commitment. He's looking for greater love. He's looking for a different place in our lives, an elevated status in our lives. So in order for that to happen, he has to interrupt us, change our way of thinking by revealing his power and who he is. Then there is a greater level of commitment after he gets into our boat. That's the sermon in a few minutes. Now, let's look at how this plays out in the life of Simon Peter, to see what has happened and will happen or is happening right now in our own boat situation. The preaching and teaching of Jesus has already attracted great crowds of people. On this particular day, the crowd has become so large that they were pressing him against the shoreline. So Jesus decides to address them from a boat and use the shoreline as a natural amphitheater. He got into one of the boats. He asked the owner to go out into the water a bit so that the people could see and hear him. After he finishes teaching the crowd, he issues instructions to Simon Peter to put out his net for a catch of fish. Simon had been washing and mending his nets while keeping one ear listening to what Jesus was teaching. After all, he had other responsibilities and duties to perform. He had to fish to make a living for his family. Jesus' call for Simon to launch out onto deeper water is an analogy of what he wants to do in Simon's life. Jesus is going to take Simon Peter to deeper, more personal commitment to himself. Simon is no different than we are. When Jesus gets into our boat and gives instructions to launch out deeper, our obedience is compromised in several ways. First, we're tempted to be guided by the people around us instead of what God says. I believe the advice of the other fishermen, the veteran fishermen, who no doubt heard this, would be, Peter, don't do it. You have your nets cleaned up and stored already. If you go back out, it's going to be a waste of time because you've spent all this time cleaning the nets and you're going to have to do it all over again. And for what? Nothing. We are tempted to be guided by the voices around us, telling us something that may be selfish in nature, telling us something, trying to keep us where we are, because if successful, it means that they will then have to respond. You may ask the question, why are people in our life, why do they act the same way? Well, maybe it's because a crisis has not been called. See, a crisis demands change. And when you decide to follow Jesus, it causes a crisis in the lives of those around you. We often wonder why our relationships displeasing, nothing's changing, everything the same, and we're miserable. It's because there has been no requirement for change. Jesus knows until he jumps into our boat and causes a crisis, we will stay in our comfort zone, the comfort zone of stagnation with no joy, little peace, and become institutionalized in a world of self-serving, sinful behavior. So Jesus takes us out of our comfort zone when he gets into our boat and gives direction that we have to make a decision to listen to him and obey or respond to the chatter and noise around us. We're battling the chatter of others, but we're also battling the chatter that's going on inside us between our head and our heart. You know, sometimes we can be too smart for faith. That's right, too smart for faith. Sometimes a move of faith is illogical, but we serve a God who makes the impossible possible. Now, I'm sure Peter in his mind says to himself, I hear what you're saying, Jesus, but let me remind you that I'm an expert fisherman. I got years in this fishing game, and I believe that the last time I checked, you specialize in carpentry. You and no one else can tell me about fishing. It's basic fishing knowledge that the best fishing on this Sea of Galilee is done at night, close to the shore. And plus, I've already cleaned these nets and put them up, and I really don't have time for this. You're asking me to launch my net out into the deep water in the middle of the day, and this, sir, makes no sense whatsoever. I'm tired, frustrated. I'm a little upset that I haven't caught any fish, and you're going to ask me to do something that I've already spent all night doing and do it in a way completely opposite to all that I know and has been proven. Jesus, you're doing the most right now. You're asking a lot of me right now. Your request is illogical, it's unconventional, it's time consuming, and it goes against what I have come to believe a favorable outcome will be. Church, the crisis caused by Jesus in our boats demands a response. We can either follow the request or simply dismiss the request. Now, I believe that Simon Peter's heart was beginning to soften because of what he heard. I believe, as I said earlier, Simon Peter heard Jesus' teaching, and he was beginning to believe Jesus based on the words of Jesus, and that paved the way for obedience to what Jesus was asking him to do. This is a witness to us that you just keep bringing them to church, Bible study, keep giving them the links to the sermon and following up with conversation, and their heart will begin to soften as well to be obedient to the voice of Jesus. Jesus was asking Peter to trust him at his word. And in order for that to happen, Jesus would have had to build up some kind of credit because of the obstacles facing Simon Peter. He faced obstacles of the voice of others and his own thoughts about what he knew to be the case about past failures of doing the exact same thing Jesus was asking him to do right now. This account has a very important lesson for Simon Peter and for us. Don't allow past failures to keep you from following Jesus. Don't let past failures keep you from serving Jesus. Don't let past failures keep us from praising Jesus. Don't let past failures keep us from Jesus. What happened in your past church has nothing to do with what Jesus is asking you to do right now. What happened with your last pastor or church members has nothing to do with where Jesus has you right now and asking you to do right now. Jesus knows you've been drifting in your boat because you were hurt and wounded and disappointed, dissatisfied with what happened before. And now the reality of your life is just floating along in my boat of life. Jesus stepped into the boat and has said to you, I need you to have a greater level of commitment in ministry. I need you to cast out deeper. And you immediately say to Jesus, been there, done that, not trying to do that again. And Jesus says, are you going to just trust the past or are you going to trust me? Jesus says, are you going to trust what you know or are you going to trust what I'm capable of? Jesus says, are you going to stay drifting in your boat or do you want to navigate to a destination I have chosen for you? Jesus is asking you to cast out your net in the middle of the day into the deep water. So what are we going to do? Past failures do not mean we stop serving the Lord. Just because we failed at something does not mean that God can't turn it around. Listen, that failure has put you in a space of dependency. That failure has opened your heart to God. That failure has opened up your ear to God and made it possible for you to be in the miracle zone. That zone where you're not trusting in your own intelligence, your own recognizance, you're not trusting in your own ability, not trusting in your own know-how, but you're completely trusting in Jesus for deliverance. Completely trusting in Jesus for a Red Sea miracle, completely trusting in Jesus to knock down the walls of Jericho in your life, completely trusting Jesus for your healing. The miracle zone is when you lift up your eyes to the hills because your help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And he will not allow your foot to be moved. He is working this thing out while you sleep because he doesn't have to. Our resolve today is to obey Jesus, saying, Jesus, I will do what you said to do and how you said to do it. So at this point in our account, while Simon Peter's heart is definitely softening, he still has not bought all the way into what Jesus is asking him to do, nor has bought all the way into who Jesus is. Peter refers to Jesus as master. Now, this word translated means overseer, supervisor. And this will be important for us to note that Peter, in fact, calls Jesus his boss or foreman or manager, recognizing that Jesus has some authority, but not necessarily authority over my life. As we come to know Jesus and we talk about Jesus being Savior, but not recognizing him as our Savior, this keeps us out of the miracle zone. We believe that he can do some things, but we're not believing him for our thing in our life. Peter recognized that Jesus has some authority, but has not given him full authority for his life. And some are like that with Jesus. And this is not a time to shame or be shamed about where you are, but acknowledge it, understand it. It does no good to be faking your faith, acting like Jesus has complete authority over your life, and he really doesn't. When we realize our disposition, our cry is, Jesus, I believe, but help my unbelief. You'll hear more about that next week. So Jesus says at this moment, let's go fishing. It's interesting to note that Jesus doesn't ask Peter whether or not he feels like casting the nets once more. Peter then feels compelled to explain to Jesus that he's been doing just what Jesus is asking. I've been fishing all night. I haven't caught anything. Isn't that usually the way we respond to Jesus when we feel tired? Yeah, Jesus, I hear you calling, but I've had a long day. Jesus, you just don't understand how busy I've been with these kids. Jesus, I've already tried what you're asking me to do and it's not borne any fruit, so it's worthless to try it again. Oftentimes, when Jesus comes into our boat, the boat of our lives, all we have are excuses for Jesus. Yes, you may be tired, but Jesus doesn't want excuses. Yes, you may have a lot going on in your life, but Jesus doesn't want those excuses. Yes, you may have intimate knowledge about what Jesus is asking you to do, but Jesus doesn't want our excuses. Here's a truth for us this morning. We do what we want to do and make excuses for what we don't want to do. We do what we want to do and make excuses for what we don't want to do. And many of our excuses come when we don't feel like doing something. And it's at those times that Jesus shows up and gets into our boat. He gets into our boat when we're tired and worn out and unplugged, and when we got a lot going on, when we seem to fully understand what we're doing, but it's not working out for us. We can't figure out why we keep failing. Why? Because Jesus wants us to be obedient regardless of how we feel or how smart we think we are, so that in our weakness and confusion, Jesus is found to be strong, that he gets all of the credit for the deliverance, for the making a way out of no way, all of the credit for the miracle that he performs in our life. So Jesus does not get into our boat for a bunch of excuses, because excuses do not save others. Excuses do not help a situation. Excuses does not grow our faith. Excuses do not make us bold. Excuses paralyzes us and mean we have given up hope. And Jesus asks us to do something. In addition to be riddled by chatter, our own prejudices and excuses, we are also tempted by fear to ignore the voice of God. You know, the greatest obstacle we face in life is our own fear. Fear of being inadequate, not good enough, fear of failure. And ultimately, it will probably mean very little in our lives if you don't overcome the fear of, say, skydiving or hang gliding or cliff jumping. It's not a big deal. She probably wasn't going to do those things anyway. But it will be disastrous for all of our lives if we don't overcome our fear of following Christ and being obedient to Christ. Question this morning: what fear is keeping you from doing God's will? What fear is keeping you from doing what God is asking you to do right now? What fear is keeping you in your seat of non-commitment? What fear is robbing God of your service, robbing God of your worship? How does Jesus take us from where we are to where he wants us to be? That's simple. By pushing us. That's how. Perhaps doing things your own way has left you empty. It's time to give God a try. Maybe your own knowledge and skills have failed you in what you're trying to do, and you need God's power, God's knowledge, God's skill. Maybe it's time for us to obey God and try things God's way, even if we don't understand where, why, or how it's all going to work out. I realize that launching out into deeper water is scary, but that's where God's blessings are to be found, is in the deep water, which is the miracle zone. Peter, with all of the negatives in his mind, finally decided to act upon that mustard seed of faith and do exactly as Jesus has instructed. And the results are recorded that there were so many fish that jumped into the nets that the nets began to break. And look what he did then. The others who doubted and maybe even suggested that he not do what Jesus was telling them to do are now being called to behold the power of God. Come help with the miraculous blessings of Jesus. We all doubted that was even possible, but now we believe that all is possible with Jesus. We got enough fish that is breaking our nets. The boats are sinking. This is the greatest catch of fish we've ever experienced in our life. And you would think it's time to celebrate the money that this catch would bring, the fame that it would bring, the recognition that this catch will bring. But what does Simon Peter do? He is overcome with his own sense of depravity. He is overcome because he finally has seen Jesus for who Jesus is. And in the midst of enjoying the greatest success as a fisherman he's ever had, fell on his knees and he says, I'm not even worthy to be in your presence, for I am a sinful man. Often when we experience great success, we forget about God, because we look at the position the miracle will bring to us, the fame, the celebrity. But Peter shows us that is Jesus that makes the miracles happen. It is Jesus who is worthy to be praised, Jesus who deserves our worship, because Jesus performs the miracle, not us. And I say worthy of worship because that is what Peter begins to do. Now, you may say, come on, Pastor, how do you know? How do you derive that Peter was in worship from just one verse of Scripture? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, worship first begins with confession of who we are. And we already see that Peter is in the midst of confession. When in the midst of all of this celebration, his response, I am a sinful man. The second part of worship begins with recognition of who Jesus is. For it is from the Greek that we can discern this transformation. Before, Peter referred to Jesus as master, boss, overseer, supervisor, and he used this Greek word epitastes. But after the miracle, Peter refers to Jesus as kurios, which means Lord. It means supreme authority. It means controller of my life. It means my God. You know, it's amazing when Jesus shows up in our boats, tells us to do something, and we have a yeah, right mentality. We call Jesus boss in a sarcastic kind of way. Then all of a sudden, his power is manifest. His power is real. His miracle is all over us, and we fall on our knees, and Jesus then becomes kurios. Jesus becomes God. Jesus becomes the controller of our life. Jesus becomes our reason for living, our motivation for success, our shelter in the storm. Jesus becomes the air we breathe. Following Jesus is all I want to do, because the way I've been living my life doesn't make sense any longer. Not my will anymore. Lord, I believe now. I want to serve you now. I love you now. and we're on fire for Jesus. We want to tell the world about Jesus. Come see what Jesus can do for you. But first, let me tell you what he did for me. He got into my boat. He changed my direction, changed my life, and Jesus can do it for you also. Jesus gets into our boat so we can recognize who he really is and to change the direction of our lives. Where are you this morning with your recognition of Jesus? Is Jesus epitastes or is he kurios? Is he just a guy with some authority or is he our God, the supreme authority over my life? When Jesus gets into our boat, we're never the same again. Jesus does not leave us in a broken state, but he restores us. He empowers us. He puts his trust in us to follow him and do what he asked us to do the way he said to do it. Peter asked Jesus to depart from him, but Jesus does not take orders from us. Jesus says to Peter the same thing he's saying to us right now. I'm not going anywhere. Let me clean you up. Let me teach you, deliver you. Let me love you. Let me comfort you. Let me give you direction. Receive my joy. Receive my salvation. Peter's response was to get back to the shore, leave everything on the shore, and follow Jesus. What will our response be now that Jesus has stepped into our boats this morning? Your miracle awaits. I want to thank you for tuning in this morning. May God bless you. May God keep you. And we look forward to seeing you next week.